I think the ecosystem is actually as important as the language these days. I wonder if you have any thoughts on, my personal belief is ColdFusion ecosystem is effing wonderful with all those tools from the Autist guys and Pete Freitag and the Integral guys in Germany and what have you. And plus what the language engine developers, Gert and the folks over at Adobe produce. But
ColdFusion Alive, the podcast for the ColdFusion community. Discover practices, tools, techniques, tips and trends for modern ColdFusion development. Brought to you by TerraTech, the ColdFusion experts. Develop, secure, optimize. Here is your host, the founder of TerraTech, Michaela Light.
Welcome back to the show. I'm here with Charlie Arehart, Ben Nadel, Gert Franz, and Mark Drew will be joining us in about 30 minutes. He had an unavoidable appointment. He's probably having a root canal at his dentist or something. I don't know. Hope not. But we're going to be talking about Adobe ColdFusion and Lucee and how they compare and contrast and all cool new features coming in the next 5 years that we prognosticate. Future performance improvements might be coming. CFML engine updates and how you can best approach those, ColdFusion security, and we'll wrap up with some other questions about being a good CFML developer and conferences this year. Welcome, guys.
Thank you for having us back.
Sure. And we're going to kick off with Ben because he was very quiet last time. I'll put in the show notes the other two panels. This is the third panel. There's so much to talk about Adobe ColdFusion and Lucee. We couldn't fit it all into one episode. So what do you think, Ben's happening in the next 5 years? That takes us through 2027.
It's a really interesting question. As someone who's strictly a developer, as opposed to Gert, who's more in the building of platforms, I tend to focus a lot on how do I best use the tools that have been provided to me, and how do I get my work done with those tools. And I tend to focus less on what I don't have and what the future could be like. So this is always a bit of a harder question for me. I think a lot of what happens in the future is going to be shaped by the changing technology and platform landscape. Obviously,
what's happening there? Do you know?
Well, just that we're heavily swinging into a platform as a service, infrastructure as a service era with things like Amazon and Lambda functions and a bunch of, there's a bunch of other platforms that now have functions as a service. And where does ColdFusion fit into that? And where are the limitations with things like licensing? I mean, obviously we don't want to get into licensing probably, but
not a problem for me.
Not a problem, obviously.
We thoroughly discussed very vigorously licensing in the first panel roundtable. So I'll refer people to that. I'm just gonna, suggest we don't, unless there's anything coming in the future.
So I guess I'll say that where I'd like to see the language go in a very abstract sense, because I don't really have specific things, is how do I take applications that are historically built on a single server and running on a single database and evolve those to be more of a distributed friendly background process kind of a workflow. And again, like I don't have a lot of hands-on experience with that kind of stuff, but I think seeing the language go in that direction would be very interesting to see what the people who are smarter than me think works well in that respect.
Saying the word people that are smarter than me implies that the other ones are smarter. So you have to live up to that if you're implying that. So thank you for the pressure. And no worries, Ben. The thing, what you will want in the future is what we will build for you. So we'll make it in that way that you definitely want to do that, right? So that you won't need those features. I mean, that is something that I like so much, being in the producing end of the food chain here. So the thing that every one of us, I eat my own dog food every day. So we're using Lucee, the latest build of Lucee, and we're soon going to use Lucee 6, which is hopefully coming out next week, somewhere Monday, Tuesday, or sometimes next week. So the first beta there. And
yeah, I just interviewed Zach on that, who's on your team, the dev team, and the community manager. And
introduction for people to understand.
Yeah, we went through all the future features and all kinds of other discussions about release cycles. And I'll put that in the notes. It was really good detail on Lucee. I'm very excited about Lucee 6.
Yeah, one thing that I'm really excited about Lucee 6 is that we're moving our configuration from XML to full JSON and to full CFconfig support. So CFconfig was kind of spearheading that evolution towards that. Makes it a lot easier for us to interact with it as well, and makes us, I have to say, also a little independent of CFconfig. So it supports the full CFconfig interface. And the thing is, yes, I know command box and CFconfig and all those things are great, fantastic additions to Lucee, but very often we're asked about bare bone Lucee as well, without any underlying, command box or whatever. So making it easier for folks to interface with, to interfere with Lucee was a big goal. And then Lucee 6, as far as I know, is going to be a lot smaller because we're not defaulting all of the packages anymore. We're going to reduce the number of packages that you need to run Lucee barebone as well. And so just one highlight that I like a lot is that we're now finally allowing thread debugging. So if you do something like a CF thread and you have debugging turned on, you finally will be able what that thread debugged in the background, right?
Oh, nice.
Usually when you see the debugging output, you only see the debugging output of the current page. But the debugging output of threaded pages is not visible. But in the admin, we have a template that allows you to see those threaded debugging outputs as well. That is one of my favorite features. And then stuff like CFHTTP being 30% faster now because we're doing connection pooling. Until now, we always did a new connection to CFHTTP over CFHTTP, for example. For DistroKid, we're using a lot of Spotify updates, figuring out, is this song live on Spotify? So we do millions of connections to Spotify, and that's where that came from. And we now do connection pooling, and that brought down our execution time by orders of magnitude, I would even say. Right.
Wow.
I mean, of course.
Yeah, DistroKid, for those who don't know, is a musician site and band site, and it's totally written in Lucee. So
yes,
probably the biggest ColdFusion site out there. You have a cluster, I assume.
We have a huge cluster. We do blue.
How big is your cluster? If you don't mind sharing that detail.
Very big. About 20 instances, I would say.
Thank God.
But we're doing completely automated deployment there. So everything is scripted. You can't handle that anymore manually. Mm-hmm. So you have to do pipelines, and you have to do deployment pipelines and everything, and monitoring like crazy. The dev team is about 45 people big. Not only the developers, but all the sysadmins, database and everything. So developers about 20, I would say. And so it is really a very huge site, and it's a great it's a great and performance site, and that's something that I like a lot. And we're using the tool that we build every day, and that also begets some new ideas for future features of Lucee. Right.
One thing that I've always sort of I've never been able to. Okay, sorry. Let me back up there a second. 99% of what I do is a request response lifecycle, meaning a user makes a request to the application and then ColdFusion responds to it in time. Obviously hitting the database, doing some file IO, pushing stuff, pulling stuff from S3, that kind of stuff. But it's all very much a on-demand kind of a thing. And you mentioned the CF thread and being able to debug CF thread. I love threading. Typically, I do that as a sort of a spin-off as part of the request response lifecycle. A user does something, and then I want to do some stuff asynchronously, but it's still kind of that on-demand model. And then we have our scheduled tasks, which are basically an on-demand request response lifecycle, but being driven by a sort of a cron job. And the thing that I really have yet to dip my foot into and wrap my head around is having persistent background threads. So for example, something that sits there and listens for message queues on SQS, or something that sits and listens for pub sub events off of Redis. And right now, I think I sort of lean on the idea that ColdFusion is built on top of Java, and there's probably a Java client that does that persistent stuff for me. But I still don't have a good sense of how that interacts with the ColdFusion application. And like, what if the thread that's running that thing dies? Like, does ColdFusion have a way to really pick that up and run it again? And I guess I'll stop and just say that one thing that I'd love is a more comprehensive, and maybe it's just a documentation issue, but a more comprehensive, you need to do something forever in the background, and here's how you should do it in ColdFusion. And hopefully it doesn't involve event gateways.
And I'm sorry that I'm taking this on, Charlie. I didn't want to steal any time of you, but just like a miracle, we just had somebody turn up right now who actually is a master on exactly what you're asking. And we have introduced something like that literally about half a year ago for DistroKid, and it's making its way into Lucee now.
Oh,
and
fantastic.
So anyway, Michaela, maybe you just want to take over for a second.
Who is this intruder, Mr. Drew?
Sorry, I was in my usual evil minds taking over the world. That ran over,
you do look slightly Dr. Evil. Could you do that little finger thing? We just need you to have a nude cat in your lap or something.
That is just slightly out of frame.
Mr. Bigglesworth.
Mr. Bigglesworth is just Bigglesworth is just slightly out of frame. But going back to the topic, things that happen in the background. So this is the most exciting thing I think that Lucee has introduced, and we're battle testing it at the moment on a few projects before we unleash it to the world and watch their little minds blow. But it's essentially an event gateway. Sorry,
Ben, but you don't have to write anything.
But you don't have to do anything. Yeah, you don't have to do anything. So basically, it's a CFC that has two functions. One's init when it starts up, and when it starts up, you could do something like probably print out going, "I've started up," and the other one is it does something every X seconds by a property, right? So you have certain properties of saying like how often to do something, and is mainly how often to wait between times of doing something, rather than like a cron job that would do this every 10 seconds. It's more like once you've done something, how long do you wait to do that again? And it just calls a function run. I can't remember if the function's run or invoke. I can't remember the name of it, but it just calls that, and then you put your code in there, which in our case it just calls it creates a component, and then all the logic is inside that component. The logic is not inside the task runner, right? Now, the nice thing about the task runners is that one, it logs to the scheduled log, because that's where you want stuff that's running on a schedule to log by default. So you're saying like, oh, this task runner started. The other one, other properties, you can say how many of them you want running at the same time. So for example, you can have 1, 5, 10, however many of them are running. And we use them in conjunction with stuff like Redis queues. Yeah. So then we don't have to lock stuff. We don't have to do this, some kind of database lock, because you can say, here's all my jobs, go and pick one. And you know that in Redis, there's only one person that can pick like that last one, right? It's atomic transactions. And then you also have kind of cooling off periods. Like if there's an error, you don't want that error always happening, right? You don't want it to do that. So you can say, if an error happens, if you've thrown an error within the task runner, let it wait for a while. Now we've got this separation of two of them. We've got the runner and the listener, because the listener is basically like your management. So you can then do whatever code management you want to do there. And the information it gives you is like how many task runners are running, when they started, all that kind of metrics that you can then log to whatever, be it, Frappy, or be it Sentry, or being whatever you want to log this, Datadog or wherever you're going to do your telemetry and logging. So it's a really exciting project. So it's been working pretty well for us. We've done a few projects in it to really like shake out the cobwebs. And the downsides, I guess, is that you have to now look more. You have to like log stuff to file, or you have to log stuff to the system out, because it's something that, as you were saying, is something.
Mark, have a look.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, let's just show those 10 lines of code you have there, Gert, and put it for those on video. Of course, we're going to have to. Can you make your font like 20 times bigger?
Okay, so big like this.
Yeah, that's much better. So for the folks on video, he's got a component here with a task, and will you talk us through it, Gert?
Mark, you can talk through it.
Sure.
It by heart.
Oh, Mark. Okay.
Yeah, it's my fault that all of this exists, because I kicked Misha under the table long enough. I said, "Fine, I'll make it." So the component extends the task, the org.lucee.cfml task. So that's all it does. You now get 6 different properties, like concurrent thread count. You can see is 3. So there's 3 of these running. So if you were printing out the task runner on line 12, you say print it out. When your server starts up, you'll see 3 of these starting up, right? And they'll have their own ID, right? So you know which one's running. Each individual has one. So how long to sleep before the call? So it's like, this is how long to wait before the next call and how long to wait after the call, right? So you can say before the call, I'm going to wait 400 seconds, 4,000 seconds, and then milliseconds, well, 4 seconds. And then once I've done something, I'm going to wait a second, right? And then I'll wait 4 seconds. So there's basically, this runs every 5 seconds.
This podcast is brought to you by TerraTech, the ColdFusion experts. Develop, secure, optimize. Get detailed show notes on today's episode and your free CF Alive Modern ColdFusion Guide at terratech.com. That is TERATECH.com. And now back to today's show.
Seconds. And here you say how long to sleep when you have an error. Go up a little bit, please.
Yeah, here, this one.
Yeah. And if you turn off your server, basically say how long wait to wait for the task to stop. So basically, Lucee won't shut down cleanly. You can be there like ending the thread and stuff like that, which is not a polite way of stopping anything. And it will wait 10 seconds for in this case, for your function to stop, and then no more will run, because it said, I know that the server is shutting down. And then we
see that when we shut down the Docker components, the Docker images, then we see that it takes 10 seconds for them to stop, because this number here says 10 seconds, and that's why we have to wait for 10 seconds. It's a graceful stop. Yeah. And the magic happens actually here.
Yeah, invoke. If you go up a little bit, go to show the function, is the invocation, which you got the ID, which is your ID, right? The ID of the thing. How many iterations it's gone through, how many times it's run, if there a number of errors have happened before, last time executed, last time I executed the last date, and it'll give you the last error. So you can sort of say like, oh, well, I've been erroring all the time. Maybe I'll just shut down, or maybe I'll do something else.
Maybe we'll cut it a little short. What we do here is we unprocess our last job, then we process the next job, and then we're done. And this is called, this is executed. And once it's executed, it waits for 4 seconds, waits another second on start. And then the next time it comes here. So this is a task that runs all the time and works on your jobs. And this is the way how we can react on incoming calls and on callbacks, or we're reacting on messages and stuff like that. It's not an event-based system. It's kind of a long polling system, but it works like a charm.
I saw
that's very cool. Sorry, Ben, go ahead.
I saw in the code there that you were referring to the application scope, and that's very exciting because I know Lucee introduced the idea of task threads. And when Gert told me about task threads, I thought, oh, this is going to be exactly what I'm looking for. I'll spin up a task thread. I'll set it to run, a bajillion times, and that'll become my background thread. But then it turns out that gets persisted to disk. And then when it gets rehydrated, it's no longer connected to the application. And then I had to do a bunch of dancing about like storing an application context in the server scope. And then the thread would try to like reconnect that. So seeing that you have a background process that is managed in a persistent way by the platform is what it sounds like, and is still connected to the applications. That's very exciting.
Careful with that. Careful with the application scope, because the task runner could start before your application scope has started.
Oh,
so you need to make sure that it's there. And the CF thread type task is great if you have an independent task that you need to make sure it runs. And I'm sorry, but I would like to give Charlie also the time to talk, because he was quiet now for half an hour almost.
How about that? Don't hear that very often.
Who is this imposter?
Well, actually, what I was, if you want to go ahead and do that, then when we started, it was interesting that Ben first talked about his being, primarily a developer, and Gert being, someone involved in the development and, production. I think you used producer of Lucee, and Mark, you had not joined yet, but I was just going to, quip about how, and then I'm like this other representative of the community in that I don't really do development. I really help people administer and troubleshoot and tune, their applications and servers, and primarily on ColdFusion, just because that's where I get most of my clients, and also on Lucee. And I just thought that was interesting because that's a different, part of our audience is also people like that. And the comment was really in the context of, as we contemplate what's intended in the future and also recently added things, what would excite people. And it's just interesting because those three audiences, well, the developers, of course, have different interests, like they may be thrilled that CFML has fat arrows and functional programming, and both Lucee and CF have those, but administrator types would be like, what are you talking about? And then the administrator types would be excited that either of the engines is either much smaller, and by the way, I know Lucee 6 is going to be much smaller, but CF 2021 did that already. It's only like 140 meg, and you can add packages to it. And this is what also struck me as listening to all that conversation, is that much of it was about Lucee, and part of our audience is Lucee only, and they really only want to hear about what's coming in new in Lucee. And part of our audience is CF only, and they would be like, well, that all sounded cool, but I'm not going to be able to do that until Adobe chooses to put it in there. And so I'm often in this, side of pointing out what CF has added, because Lucee folks might typically not care. Now, Gert might care because he's trying to decide what should we add and what should we not bother to add. And then the community of people are in there in the, in the various communities, whether it's the Slack or the dev.lucee.org, and they may be pushing for something that they liked, or they'll argue against something they don't like. And this is the just fascinating thing to sit here in this community and watch these various perspectives being represented. And there's been some interesting recent blow-ups in both communities because different perspectives have very different perceptions of things. And we talked about wrangling cats. There's a lot of that in this community, and it's a challenge with just a meeting like this, because the folks who might not be interested in the topic just have to be patient and let the other discussion happen, because even though it may not float their boat, it floats the boat of the people that are discussing it. And that's I would just think that's
I think, to be fair, there's a lot of cross fertilization between Adobe ColdFusion and Lucee. Lucee comes out with new features if they're seen as really cool and work well. I've seen Adobe copy features Lucee put out, and vice versa.
Actually, vice versa. That's right.
It's good to have friendly competition.
Sure.
I think there used to be like a CFML language committee, standards committee, but I think that died after
Talk about wrangling cats.
Yeah, there was a lot of cat wrangling there. Yeah, but informally, I think that happens. So, sorry, Mark, go ahead.
That's right. I think one of the things that so just going back to the previous project, that we learned from that was putting features for different target audiences. Like one target audience was kind of my DevOpsy SysOps kind of hat, which I don't have here, that I'm wearing, which I'm saying, well, this has to actually report where does this log to, and how do we log this in Docker? Because is this in a lot of stuff in Docker is very much silent somewhere out there in the forest, and you're not going to go to a specific Docker instance. You literally don't care, but you do care that tree has fallen down in the woods somewhere because you need to log it, right? So that's one hat. But the other hat is like kind of Gert's side. I guess at the time when he was working on the of a developer, like I need to have access to the shared resources, data sources on a basic level, and whatever a service layer is, that's a developer kind of hat. And then you got other people that can learn from all of this, saying, okay, well, I've got to your point about Docker image sizes. I was just in a meeting and we got a very super light version of Lucee to do a microservice, essentially the minimum amount of code you can do to run an executable, right? But as a web service, right? As a web service, and that's like a 200 meg file now. We have like a 200 meg Docker image that is our Docker file. So, and that's kind of like such different audiences. And I love having been in this business, as most of the people around this virtual table, that you've probably had to wear that hat at some point. So you might.
I'm going to add one. I'm going to throw one other hat for your audiences, which is missing and is often forgotten, which is the CIO level. They're not coding in ColdFusion necessarily, though some of them I've talked to do, but they do make decisions about what technology the company is going to use. And I think sometimes they get forgotten by Adobe and Lucee in our, when we talk about stuff, what's important to them. And, I'll throw out some things that I've heard that's important to them: reliability of the engine and the apps, easy to scale, secure, and feeling that the thing is modern, which I believe Adobe ColdFusion and Lucee both are modern languages. Despite the 25 years old, they've been going through many updates. I can't count the number of releases that Lucee has had, because you do all these micro point update thingies. But we must be on. I can't think maybe Charlie knows what version we're actually on. I got confused when they switched from version numbers to years.
What do you mean, the latest
version 18 or something?
2021 is the latest.
Well, if you counted, the last numbered version of Adobe ColdFusion was 11, right?
11.
Okay. So now we've had 3 since then. So now we're on 14.
14, right? Yeah.
And Lucee went through some Raylo versions, and then it's. Your versioning numbering is a bit weird, because you add lots of new features, but you don't bump up the version number.
Right.
Well, we go from 3.4, 5.4, 5.3, 5.4, and then 6 is where we change the interface. Interface, and we change, for example, basic configuration. So one thing that we might change for Lucee 6 is that @token by default is off, right? With CF location.
Right. Very cool.
And many things, we only change those things in major version changes, and we now just have a few things up to decide for, where we decide how we're going to change different behaviors, because some behaviors are getting out of date, right? Like, for example, using application CFM is not the default anymore, right? And even if you're having application CFM and CFC searched for, when you're going up the chain from a deep directory looking for these, you always have at least 2 file requests: application CFC or CFM, until you're up to the basic root. And we might change that, and of course have a compatibility switch which says put it to how it was before. And if you want to speed it up, just uncheck those boxes. And so those things change only in major versions. And actually, Lucee, with its older companion Raylo, turns 20 next year.
Wow! Happy birthday!
Next year, yeah.
One of the things that, to Michaela's point was about CIOs, as well as like whether it's modern, whether it's secure, which are kind of standard stuff, whether it's fast. Fast is like
relative.
Relative stuff. By the way, like a couple of points. One, we were second fastest language in
Woo!
right?
Yeah, that
in
was Brad Wood's
Post.
blog
Yeah,
post.
And it wasn't him doing the test. It's an external test, which I'm trying to look up, but I'm sure we can put it in the show notes down below. But the other thing is, and this is from our experience, is getting new developers, like fresh, I say fresh developers, like they're unpacked out of university in cellophane still covering them. But like new developers that come from other languages are able to do and be productive in less than a week. And we've seen this, like, and it's not like we did some intensive, like, boot camp at DistroKid. We're a remote company. We welcome new people on board, and they're being productive. And the range of the people that we've had have been university students, all the way to recent graduates, all the way to experienced developers, and I don't know what else have come in there. Like DevOps engineers are already writing Lucee at DistroKid because it makes sense. It's a programming language that makes sense in comparison to, I'm going to say JavaScript, and people are going to come and burn me from that side, in comparison to stuff like the promise-based approach of JavaScript, which is very powerful. I completely understand how it works, but it's kind of be a paradigm shift. CFML isn't that much of a paradigm shift, right? Yeah. You have lovely tag-based language for your views where you have to integrate into HTML, and you got a lovely functional-based language, the syntax, sorry, not language, syntax that you can use for your business logic and database logic. And we can have arguments about where all of that goes and what your favorite one is. But when you're teaching new people as a CIO saying, I need to ramp up in staff, I need to increase the amount of people that are running this, apart from anything, they need to understand our business logic. Then you spend more time teaching them business logic than you do the syntax.
Were you waving to say you wanted to contribute, Charlie?
Yeah, I just wanted, as soon as there was a good break there, I just wanted to point out, in case folks didn't see it or hear about it, that on the first session of the Dev Week this week, my talk was ColdFusion more modern than most realize. And while obviously being at the ColdFusion Dev Week, it focused on Adobe ColdFusion primarily, much of what I talked about applies also to Lucee. And it was that point, very, very point of how CF and CFML, both the language and the features, have evolved. And I covered both of those in quite a bit of depth. And that was my point, was that people who are coming from other languages could find that either they could write things that they're more comfortable with, or they might even find that other CF developers are already writing code that they could be more comfortable with. But we do have to admit that a lot of times if a developer from another language comes in and the app is all written in tags and doesn't take advantage of anything new and modern, they're going to find it pretty annoying. But the good news is that if people want to develop in more modern ways or to deploy in more modern ways, they absolutely can. And that's great to see.
And I'll mention that in the last panel we did, and I'll put the link in the show notes, we had an extensive discussion about resources for learning ColdFusion, among books and online resources that are free. So conferences and trainings, so check that out. I do want to say, from people I speak to, CIOs or CTOs, they often get frustrated trying to hire ColdFusion developers, and they don't really take on that what you're saying, Mark, is the truth. And it's not just DistroKid that does this. Autis does this. TerraTech does this. Plenty of modern ColdFusion companies will hire people and then cross-train them. They're a great developer in other languages. They do modern programming techniques. They use modern tools, an ecosystem. And it's really easy to pick up ColdFusion. So I almost think there's a gap there that maybe can be filled in the future. Maybe a hackathon or a boot camp, or what are those things, language boot camps, where people get intensive training in JavaScript for but with JavaScript it takes months, right? Those boot camps last weeks and weeks, I think.
But you've seen this like over a period of time. I remember working in Soho, part of London, in the height of the web development craze. This is never going to take off, trust me. But don't buy Bitcoin from me in 2003. That's what I'm saying. But the whole point was that CIOs, I'm talking specifically to what you're talking about, Michaela, were very much with whatever trend was in whatever Computer Weekly was happening at the time, and And this is why companies like Microsoft, I'm going to get my tinfoil hat out in a minute. We're spending a lot of money in getting into publications like Microsoft. So people went, oh, we don't need ASP.NET developers. And I know a lot of contractors who are polyglots because they knew this was a trend. So you can do your ASP, you can do your .NET, you can do your PHP. I know some of them writing all of them. And it's not that he was smart. It was just like, well, I'll take whatever contract's going. And you could see whatever the seasonality of it. Now, without getting there are too many variables with CIOs that I've met that depends what the fashionable thing is at the moment. Cloud first being like fairly popular right now. A few years back was microservices was the old rage, and now it's going back to monorepos because heralding all of these microservices when you broke everything down into tiny bit could get a little bit. I mean, and the truth is, we all know that like different applications are different beasts, and some the truth is sometimes somewhere in the middle. But by CIOs, I find them very scatty in the sense of the decisions over a long period of time is based on which conference is being sponsored by which, a software provider.
It may be less formal than that, Mark. I mean, I won't mention any names here, but sometimes the CEO's wife or husband reads a newspaper article that says Java is the hot thing.
Right.
And they're like, everything has to be dropped, get rid of ColdFusion, everything, switch to Java because that's what needs to be done. And that's seriously how technical decisions sometimes happen in organizations. It's not, right. There isn't like a serious consideration of what would be best for the organization.
And I have to say that is one of the reasons. Sad. Yeah, I'm sorry. And I think that it was also one of the reasons why it took a long time for Rilo to be accepted, because we took the other approach. We went to the developers first and tried to convince all the developers at conferences. And, who trusts a small company from Switzerland with 5-6 developers, and they go and rock the world?
No marketing budget, right? No marketing budget.
Yeah,
I remember this 2008. How does Rilo at the time, a tiny company from Switzerland, and I know Switzerland's a rich country, but how does it compete with Macrometer / Adobe at the time, right? Just in advertising budget, right?
I'd like to compare it to Microsoft or Oracle, because they really do a lot of push for their languages, Java and .NET, respectively.
That's exactly, and that's exactly it. We tried to, of course, reason with all the CEOs, CIOs, CTOs, and tell them, hey, listen, we're not going to go away. This is our sole project, so we're putting all of our resources into it, and we survived, and we have proven that. And it got easier, let's say, for the last 5-6 years, because
I know we only
have a history.
I know we only have 12 minutes left of Ben's brilliance before he has a hard stop. The rest of us can carry on talking if we want to. Do you have any? What I'm going to direct us to, I think the ecosystem is actually as important as the language these days. I wonder if you have any thoughts on, my personal belief is ColdFusion ecosystem is effing wonderful with all those tools from the Altis guys and Pete Freitag and the Integral guys in Germany and what have you. And plus what the language engine developers, Gert and the folks over at Adobe and produce. But you have any thoughts on the future of the ecosystem, Mr. Ben?
Well, one thing that's been point of mind for me lately, as I've been getting much more into the Lucee side of things, and we just talked about modernization of the language, I find myself a little bit torn between two worlds in so much as, am I a Lucee CFML developer or am I a ColdFusion developer? And what I mean by that is, when I write demo code, for example, or I write a library, do I care that it runs in Adobe ColdFusion as a Lucee developer primarily? And that becomes an interesting question when you think about modernizing your applications, because as an example, one thing that I've been fascinated with but have not taken a step towards is turning on full null support, because I have null support in other languages and it's been pretty beneficial. But I feel like the moment I turn that on, I basically can't use any third-party library that doesn't expect nulls to work how they've worked historically. And that's just a small example, but Lucee, as another example, has, I think, a much more enjoyable tag support in script, which is that all I have to do is remove the CF and I can use any tag. And Adobe ColdFusion does it by adding parentheses and curly braces. And it's a matter of preference. But again, like if I start to write my code with a very Lucee specific syntax, I'm no longer writing Adobe compatible code. And do I care? And do I care as a community representative? Do I care as a library author, et cetera, et cetera? And I'm finding like I don't know what the right path to modernizing is, because I just don't know how much I care about those various things yet, if that makes sense.
And I'm going to answer your question with maybe a postulation that happened this week. This is where open source comes in, I would say. It's like if you're doing your for example, you library writer hat on, right? I hope there's a GitHub for that library that you wrote. Great,
Obviously.
right? Obviously, right? And if someone comes along and says, I wanted to use this, but it doesn't work with Adobe, it's like, well, hey, create an issue and submit a PR, right? And then we can find a way for it to do. There's patterns that we can do, like including based on stuff. I don't want to get into the technicality and when the process, because I've had to do that this week. I wrote some stuff for a library, an AWS library, and do I care it doesn't run on ColdFusion? Not really, because I'm not using it. I'm using it for my practical case. If someone down the line, someone says, well, this doesn't work on ColdFusion, I might happily spend like 10 minutes like changing it so it's like common code or whatever. But I'm not going to do it out of the box, right? I'm going to do it with whatever I enjoy for my use case. And this is the weirdness about open source, I find, because I do everything very selfishly in open source. I contribute selfishly. I wanted this to work for me. And I contributed to your library because I wanted it to work for me. If I went to your library and you said, I've got this Adobe CF code and it doesn't work on Lucee, well, I would have said, here's a PR to make this code work on Lucee. Selfishly, you know. Yeah. And I think that's what you have to be. Otherwise, you're not the parent of every CFML developer. And you will have someone saying, well, it doesn't run on like ColdFusion MX 6.1.
And yeah, I just want to echo. I want to echo that to the listeners, because sometimes in the past there's been kind of a victim mentality. You know what? Oh, the language doesn't work the way I want it to, and they just whine about it on forums instead of like doing what Mark says, make a pull request and, you know, take some action, do the best you can. Look, not everyone can write the Lucee engine code. And obviously there's only about 30 guys in the Adobe team writing their code, or whatever the size of their dev team is. But we all can make requests for improvements. We can all document how a bug is in the language, or, you know, we can add to the documentation, like we said in the last panel. There's lots of things. Everyone listening, this is your ColdFusion country calling you to help out. Everyone listening could do some contribution to improve ColdFusion in this year. Whatever that small thing is.
Absolutely. Yeah, that is absolutely true. And I totally concur what you're saying, Michaela. I just wanted to respond to Ben as well. As soon as you write a library, then it is very important that you're cross-compatible, because you don't know who's using your library. Right. In the first place, as Mark said it, you're just making sure that it runs on your code, but then open it up for pull requests. To be honest, in our private application that we write, we don't care about ColdFusion compatibility at all. Because, you know, we know exactly that we're not going to switch to ColdFusion. So we're taking full advantage of everything that the language has to offer to us. And therefore, it is really only important when you're interfering with others and others' code, right? Because there, it is important that the compatibility is given. But if we're using query listeners or mail listeners or thread backgrounds or cached CF-HTTP calls, that is something where I don't really care about the compatibility, and maybe you could keep it in the same way.
I want to toss out a couple things on this topic. One is that back in June, Gavin Picken did a talk on the CF meetup on how to find, install, and implement third-party libraries in CFML. So he was addressing that very point of how if you're going to either use or contribute to or offer a library, how to consider those prospects of the possibilities of running on the different engines. He touched on that a bit. One thing I wanted to also get back to before we might lose anybody is that the original point we started with here was discussion of the ecosystem. And I want to make sure everybody hears this. At the Dev Week yesterday, the Adobe folks did a live demo of their new VS Code extension for ColdFusion. And one, it's just an extension for CFML, so people will be able to use it if they use Lucee. But of course, there are things in it that are tied to CF, RDS-based things like the debugger and the data source, live query editor. Those things, until something's provided for to do that RDS integration with Lucee, that won't work with Lucee. But the majority of things, people were on the call and making lots of positive comments about what they saw that had been done. And of course, this opens up another can of worms in the VS Code extension area, because there's at least a couple, Kamasamake and I'm sorry, I forgot the second one.
JC Banquist, I think is the other one.
Yeah, so there's two primary current VS Code extensions for CFML, and now along will come Adobe's. And by the way, said in the Dev Week session, it's going to be free. So and it's fast.
Free.
Is it open source? Hang on. Is it open
Well, let's
source?
clarify. They said that it's free, but it's not open source because it contains those proprietary things that talk to ColdFusion.
I don't know if it's technically possible, but I'd suggest to them they kind of isolate the proprietary stuff in one part, and the rest of the code's open source.
Sure. Because then you won't get
more
people
easily
like
accessible.
making that stinky face, because it's a shame to have that, be the first response someone's going to have.
Yeah, we would gladly contribute to that to make it Lucee compatible as well. But I can understand Adobe as well, that they would say, hey, we're not interested in having Lucee compatibility with that one, which I understand.
Yeah.
Well,
I don't. We can ask. Let's ask them. They may be totally open to people helping out and improving their code if they can keep the stuff they have to license from other people in a separate compartment.
I think RDS
possibly
is proprietary technology to Adobe. So that's the one part that I haven't seen the tool, by the way, Charlie. So
I'm sure it can be compartmentized, or whatever the correct technical term is. That code gets put in a function, and that you don't get the function, but everything else you can get to. Anyway, Ben, I know you have to leave for a mandatory hard stop all hands meeting where they reveal the new brand of cat food that will be served at the company.
New computers.
Or is it dog food? It must be dog food. You have a dog, yeah.
Well, thank you again.
So thanks for joining the panel. We're going to carry on, but do you have a final word you want to say?
Just that I love the ColdFusion community, and I absolutely love writing ColdFusion. And on a day-to-day basis, I don't run into roadblocks. I don't find myself yearning to have features of other languages, and I can only imagine it continuing to get better. But I will leave with that, and thank you guys so much, and have a great day.
All right, thanks, Ben. And now Ben's gone, I can talk about him behind his back and say that his blog is effing amazing. He writes pretty much every single day about new features in Lucee or Adobe ColdFusion and how he's tried them out, and he discovered here are the boundaries of whatever. He's on a Star Trek 5-year mission to explore new ColdFusion lands and discover strange creatures that might be living there. I want to talk about, go ahead.
So I'm saying we all have different goals, like Ben does a blog post, I do a PR, Gert shouts at me. It's it's a circle of life.
Well, and Charlie does a lot of blogging and posting on LinkedIn and elsewhere as well.
He wasn't disparaging. Yes. I understand that. Hey, I just shared the link. The video for the session yesterday is online on YouTube, and I just shared the YouTube video link in the show notes.
Yeah, and I want to give a shout out to the Adobe folks for getting their videos published within a day, because in previous years, them and other conferences took like 3 or 4 weeks, and it's like the excitement has died down by then. And just pump it out a raw version straight away is the way to go, I would say. I wanted to ask about machine learning and AI, because a lot of other tools have some kind of automated stuff, and I know I've talked to some of the Adobe engineers who've done a lot of machine learning study, and so I've got to guess they're trying to plug that into the language somehow.
Well, it's fashionable, right? It's like
it is fashionable.
It's the latest craze, but
it is. Yeah, every other website I visit ends in .ai, and it's like, okay, guys, is it really AI, or did you just have a good marketing?
Or is there a whole bunch of if statements? Do we really know the difference?
Yes.
Well, the thing is that that's the beauty of CFML. I'm just going to say generally that because we're tied into Java, you can put TensorFlow information there. The problem with ML is not so much the language or the logic that we'd be doing to train a data set that you'd have. Is one is the storage for that data set, because it can be massive, and you have to have, like, depending if you've got a GAN network that's like adversarial GAN network that you're saying, no, it's right, and yes, it's correct, is also the computation power that goes with it. So you can't be running it just on general servers. You have to have like stuff with GPUs on it for it to run in any real, time scale. And those are kind of expensive, but I don't see there's a technical limitation for writing machine learning interfaces or into Lucee, for example. We could probably do a library with fairly easy, and I'm writing your tensors.
Well, there's plenty of existing machine learning libraries for Python, so it'd be probably quite easy just to put a wrapper around that and call them. But I wasn't so much thinking of adding it to the language. I was thinking, how can the language engine use machine learning to improve the experience by automatically doing stuff, whatever that might be, maybe improving the security or the performance.
I have an idea. Just install the extension called tab9. This tab9 extension knows more about me than I know about myself. So you can connect that tab9 extension for VS Code with your repository, and it takes the most common things that you were about to write, and it proposes them to you. And it sometimes does really magical guessing. It knows exactly how my line is going to look like, because I'm sure in the background the guys go, he's going to write the same bullshit again. So here you go. Let me propose it to him, and he's 9 out of 10 times he's clicking on it.
Microsoft has just done that, but they've tied it to all of GitHub. Yep. So it's kind of like tab9 instead of just your repo. It's like everyone's public repos, I think.
For better or worse.
Yeah, for better or worse, because then people are going like, wait a minute, that's not in the license, and you go like, well, actually, you did say that you could use it for, this that's why it's called open source, right? Hey, and
by the way, now that we're right above each other in the video, I've had a lot of people commenting about how much you and I look alike. You've got a mustache though.
I want to sit this way just so that we, like completely different. Rather
we're not parallel. It's a parallel universe.
And I'm pretty sure.
But no, you guys both make great points. Because those are the first things I thought of when the question was first raised. Was that insofar as integrating ML in your CFML, integrating with Java would be great. And I know that's not where you wanted to go. We'll get back to that in a second. But I also want to throw out that I just had noticed today that at the end of the day, today's last session on the Dev Week is a talk by Brian Buchhold, and it's in his case specifically, it's exploring the AWS Java SDK developer, but it's talk about integrating CFML and Java. So some people don't know that that's possible, and it's actually been possible for a long time. And in fact, a funny little with a bar bet. If I were to ask people when was the first time you could integrate CFML and Java, in fact, you guys are been around long enough. We'll play the bar bet right here. When could you first integrate Java from CFML?
I was going to say during the Emacs era when we moved over to Java, right?
Java, right? CF6.
Yeah. But I believe it's earlier because there is actually a CFX tags that you could actually run Java
Not only CFX tags, you're right, and even
C++,
CF 451,
right?
I believe, is when it was added. We could do a CF object or create object to call a Java object. So we've been able to integrate CFML and Java even way back then. You just pointed to the Java class path of where the library was, and your Java engine, and it could load it. But you were saying, Mark, something?
And Corba.
Yes, and Corba, which finally is gone. But
and
then,
I guess it was a DLL you could call as well.
You could do DLLs as well. And then to Gert's point, that was another great one. And that was the second thought I had, was that we who might look for things about CFML coding being improved, one of the benefits is that, yes, there's things in VS Code, or even more broadly, GitHub. And that's where I think we, as CF people, can take some comfort that even if the engine makers don't specifically do something to support us, there are these touch points that not only we could leverage now, but more importantly, what's really good will bubble to the surface, because lots of ideas are thrown against the wall to see what sticks. And the ones that are really good will eventually be clear and obvious. And that's when sometimes you see either Adobe or Lucee leverage that thing because they feel like, yes, there's been enough clear evidence and win. But back to your original point about the engines themselves, I'll let Gert speak to Lucee. I'll just throw out, I'm not aware of anything in the CF space, although I will throw out that in 2018, when Adobe added that performance monitoring toolkit, either in 2018 or 2021, they added
2018
called connector tuning. Well, right, it came out in 2018, but I think it might have been in 2021 that they added what they call connector tuning. So they were implementing some additional intelligence. I think it was even with 2018. Because if you guys have seen that connector heartbeat URL, the connector call, and it causes trouble for some people sometimes, but that thing is sending metrics about the connector from either Apache or IIS to CF, which sends it to the PMT, which uses that to do, I don't know if we want to call it machine learning. Like you said, Mark, it's glorified conditional checking, but it makes decisions based on that. And that's just a sign of where at least there's a step in the direction. And certainly much more could be done. And I think Michaela's getting at that point, is what could the engines do to dramatically...
I'm sure these young gentlemen down here have something to say, but I
young gentlemen,
without a quick vision for this is that
give us your vision.
We reduce developer stress. When I've done a survey on health challenges people have, stress is the number one thing. And so many developers are stressed out. And anything we can do in the ecosystem or the environment to help developers get their code working easier through, whether it's through machine learning or other, predictive stuff in the IDE. And I just have this vision that the technology, whatever level this is, whether it's machine learning or clever, clever, whatever you want to call it, it kind of looks at the code and it says, okay, these lines are, the engine knows that this stuff could be performing slowly, or it can see through running the code that, hey, there are dodgy, that's a technical term, dodgy sections of the code, and you should be looking at this section of the code, guys, because it's maybe error prone, or it's slow, or it's insecure. And we know that kind of information, but why can't it be injected back into the IDE, and then they kind of color highlight or have some clippy thing that comes up and says, you need to improve your security.
Right. As someone that's written this stuff, which are literally, when I worked for Rilo, I actually wrote literally that. There's a couple of layers happening here. One, you got Java hotspot compiler anyway, that looks at areas of compiled code and improves the speed of them for you. So this is like a very low level stuff. It'll work for Lucee, it'll work for every Java version there. The other one is telemetry about your, or telemetry, the accent. Put the accent.
What does that mean in regular English?
Telemetry. In regular English, it means logs, but it's metrics about your code. So
I like it.
Right. So it's not so much just logs going like, you did this, you did this, you did this, there was an error. Is we had something, I cannot remember the name of the project that we had at Rilo, which basically said this line of code ran 50,000 times and it ran at this speed, which meant that you could get statistics on groups of things. But now that the problem is, like, if you have a line-based approach, these 10 lines might not be too slow in themselves, but the whole function call is very slow. So if you look at the function call of that line,
I think initially it would be kind of indicative. It's like, I suspect these lines. It would be like a Dr. Watson to Sherlock Holmes mentality. The developer is Sherlock Holmes' brilliant mind. Dr. Watson asks the stupid questions that help Sherlock kind of find the solution. And if we could just kind of indicate, here's a section of code you should be looking at. And I know we already have third-party linting tools, and we have third-party performance tools and whatever, and they all give reports, but it doesn't integrate back into where you're looking at the code.
This is what we tried to do with Eclipse, was a way to say, like, this is my project. Now, you have to integrate three things, right? Something that's running live, that's a specific version, that's the same version as the code that you're running, right? So we have version control. We've got all the tools here, so you could say, right, exactly, show me what the live server looks at, and it'll highlight files.
So maybe there needs to be an API or an interface layer that lets the tools talk to the ADI. Oh, you have it.
Lucee has that. Lucee has that. Wait, Lucee has that. There is a tool, a thing called page parts in Lucee.
What's it called? Say that again in English.
Page parts. Just
page parts.
There is a page, and parts of that page. Page parts. Oh. And these page parts are compiled into the Lucee debugging. They're coming at as the metrics of the Lucee debugger, and they contain which statement took how long to execute and how many times has it been executed. And we provide that information. We can provide it, I suppose, over an API as well. But for us, it wasn't the focus just yet to write an IDE for this or an implementation for the IDE. So we have the information. Maybe we can talk to some of the folks that have written the CFML implementation or the linting implementation, and have them use this information to colorize in the IDE. Hey, this was your last 10.
I'm going to take your page parts feature, which sounds really cool for performance tuning, and I'm going to ante up code coverage thing, because I know that the Fusion Reactor guys have like this clunky, I won't say it's clunky, it's actually very clever, but it requires turning on the debug level in Fusion Reactor, which some of my clients don't like having that turned on all the time on production servers. But I'd love a way to see in my IDE, this code has never, ever been effing run ever in the production or QA server, Yeah.
And there, or when you run your test suite, test suite, which code has not been tested.
Has it been exercised?
And what the good thing about these page parts is, and there is really something that I think nobody has ever thought of, you can do post debugging. Right, so you can do a post step-by-step debugging, seeing where did the code go through. Oh, and here the if statement went that way, and here it went that way. So that is a nice thing. Now you have the debuggers, and the debuggers will stop the code at the server level, and then just you have to go to the next line, and to the next line, etc. But you have no record. Right?
That's not when you're doing it. You're not doing it live on a server. You want to see like this is what happened.
So for example, you could record it on a live server and then have that sent to your local machine, and then you look at that code and see, this is how it executed. There's the issue, because I actually wanted the if statement to go in the other direction.
Oh, right. So like a replay, it would be like an instant replay.
Yeah, it's a replay.
Matches.
You could more or less, with a clever tool for VS Code, you could actually just click the play button, and then it opens up files and just says, here I am, and I'm doing this, and and whatever. And here's the output that we generated, because the page parts not only contain the execution time of each individual line and how long it took from byte this to byte that, it also contains a separate thread which contains the output generated. And one of the features that we wanted to build, and given the lack of funding, we never got around it, is that you get a list. You go to the view source part of your page, you click on a specific, let's say, empty character, and then you right-click and say, show me where this has been produced. So it goes into your IDE and shows you the line of code which produced exactly that space that you were looking. And we got
really hate spaces in your output, don't you, Gert?
Yeah, I mean, yeah. Exactly.
I want to suggest a related thing, which is language feature coverage. And maybe you guys do this behind the scenes and I just don't know. Maybe Adobe, I think Adobe does do this, which is which functions and which tags and even which parameters of which functions ever get used and how much, because I've got to believe some features get used a million times more than other features. There's probably features in the language that have never been used. I'm sorry to say that.
But there's different drivers there, right? So the driver for Adobe is a commercial one. So what you do is you add that telemetry. That's exactly what it is. It starts saying, like, well, which features of our system is being used, because then we can build new features that we can then sell to a customer. Or I'm not saying this is just a commercial business. It's a commercial business, and I'm not saying that's that decision, because you'll have product owners, and working with a lot of product owners, that they'll want to have a lot of information about that, right?
But that notion of either engine being able to know that sort of stuff would require not only that they track it, but then that they have some way to send it back. And I'll just say, so nobody thinks this is going on. There's nothing in ColdFusion that currently does that sort of telemetry to tell Adobe what aspects of CFML are or aren't being used. They would really need to do that through their testing and libraries. And I think what you were getting at as much was an individual developer. They would like to know. And that discussion of code coverage, that's been a holy grail for a long time. And I just wanted to share a couple things in response to that. The feature in Fusion Reactor that facilitates that, it's not the debugger, it's what they call the CFML line execution code tool. And it's a checkbox inside of a settings of the plugin. Anyway, and once you do that, it produces output that is every line that was ever executed in order. And that can be used for code coverage. I believe Testbox integrates it. And Gert, if you guys never did anything that leveraged it, right? You're talking about the page parts is a way you were thinking of doing it, and that isn't yet either available. So no current IDE does what Michaela was proposing.
Exactly. So the thing is this: we have all the information. We could provide the information,
cool. But
we just need a feedback into VS Code, And I would love to talk to somebody who does VS Code plugins, and then we can just provide that for
the problem with VS Code for that kind of stuff is that you have, compared to CF Eclipse, I have a little knowledge on this, is that CF Code doesn't allow you to create many panels that are completely custom. I mean, you can see Git lens, but it's not part of the idea. It's saying, like, this is the language contributions you can do. These are the window panels you can do. These are and they're generally trees of some sort of data, right? So you could do it in the sense that you'd have to rewrite how everything is shown and highlight, and doing code colorizing for the editor is not as easy. You'd have to put, like, these are the problem areas, or create your own editor in a weird way, because it doesn't allow you to say this line has to be red.
Well, I'll say this is interesting. If you see the VS Code extension Adobe showed, and if you start working with it with their debugger, they do have the multiple panels, and they do literally, as you're stepping through the code, it's showing as it goes, and other parts of the window are updating to track the variables at that point. I'm not saying that that's necessarily equivalent to what you're bringing up, but just to say that they had to tackle that dilemma as well.
Well, that's a slightly different dilemma. Because built into the VS Code, there is a debugging function that will allow you to just say, hey, you've debugged, you stopped at this line on this thing, and these are the tokens that are this line. So you can
I think, firstly, this needs to be an API or an interface layer to VS Code and other editors, so that all languages and all tools can hook into it.
And that's what
we don't have to reinvent the wheel every time.
Right.
And secondly, my personal vision for this is this kind of like an overlay view. If I want to view the performance of the code, I click a feature or a button or whatever, and it overlays, here's the hotspots. If I want to view security, I can click a second thing. If I want to view code coverage, another thing. If I want to view idiot code written here warning, from the predictive machine learning stuff,
everything is red.
I can put that on.
And that's all purely generic, would be of value to anybody in any language. So I would think that's the kind of thing that eventually something like VS Code will add.
But VS Code is mostly open source, right? They've got some proprietary stuff that you can't get to the Microsoft. There's even an open source version of VS Code that doesn't have any of the telemetry or other bullshit stuff that Microsoft plugs into it. I say bullshit stuff, I'm being a whatever, but you can have a pure open source version of VS Code. It's called VS Codium, or I forget
Codium,
what
right.
the name
And all
is.
I was getting at was that ecosystem, whether it's any vendor or people contributing, that I would think that's where we can hope that in the future, the idea you have, somebody else either will have it or does have it, maybe already has it, and then they'll identify a way to provide API
for us to API
from language.
And then let me add some steroids to this idea. We're going 5 years out. There's a lot of technology. I personally am not a great fan of virtual reality, but a lot of people are. And why couldn't the code editor have a virtual reality thing where you can kind of zoom in and zoom out and kind of give a personality to bits of the code, and there's little,
you don't want that. You don't want that.
You don't want
Michaela, I need to
the horror.
You need to drop.
I need to actually drop because I have another meeting.
Thank you. Thank you. No, we appreciate you. We will wrap up without you. We appreciate all your Lucee contributions and your fabulous Swiss.
See you all soon. Thank you. Take care.
See you, sir.
All right.
Yeah, it's probably a good time to wrap up because people are listening. And
we should wrap. We've been going for quite a long time, but
why don't we? I didn't have a wrap prepared. You have to tell me.
Raps comes out of the brain in a kind of.
It's like I'm not a rap.
It was. We'll put some music on for you, Mark. That'll get you into the mood, and then you can,
Well, we've got Power Duo.
Come out with one.
We've got Charlie and me.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, you've got Dr. Evil on one side and whatever Charlie's nickname is on the other side.
Dr. Good.
Dr. Good, yeah. Dr. Feel Good. I think we could probably let's just talk briefly about CFML engine updates, and because I know that affects a lot of people in DevOps because they're trying to apply things, and there've been some hiccups in Adobe ColdFusion that it was hard to apply the updates because the UX got broken and they fixed it, but you could only get the fixed version by applying the prior ones that had the broken UX.
Well, that was back in 2018. 2018.
Yes,
and that was.
I still have clients running 2018, Charlie. As you do, I'm sure.
I mean, what I would say, like the big change. There's a thing called the 12-factor application, right? It's a 12factor.net. And one of the things is codify your system in config files, right? So however you build your server, it should be in config files. Whether it's using command box as what's deploying them, command box is a game changer for stuff, or whatever it is, like Vagrant or Ansible or any kind of thing that builds your server. Codify that, because what you need to do is do testing, right? So you want to see that the update doesn't break anything. You're not going to do that on live servers. I mean, I know people do, but you shouldn't be doing that. So you should have a branch that has like, this is our upgrade to this version of Lucee or this version of ColdFusion, 2022, whichever version, minor version, 2021. Sorry, Charlie, I'm about out of the loop with Adobe versions. But do you know what I mean? It's like, it's not just 2021. It's going to be Adobe 2021.5 or 1.5 or whatever patch it is. And that should be codified. And if you're looking at me funny going like, what do you mean codified? It's like, there should be a file there that says, to run this code, you have to have this version of your engine. And when you deploy that, it reads that and it automatically deploys that.
So I'll throw out that insofar as that particular point, just to be clear, in case people didn't know, there's Docker, container images, whether you use Docker or other container runtimes. There's container images for Lucee, from Lucee, from Adobe, for CF, and then from Mortis, they have what they call command box images for either Lucee or CF. And each of them are different. They work in different ways from each other. And I'll be doing a talk actually at Into the Box's pre-conference in about a month. Early September or late August, I'll be doing a talk on comparing the differences between those three classes of images. But I just want to say that would be one way some people could achieve what Mark's asking about. And I'm sure he knew that. I'm just saying for the sake of listeners. So for example, with the CF images, they have an image for each CF version, and each update, when they come out with a new update, they create a new image. So the image is pre-baked already, has the update in it. So you don't have to do that. So that goes back to Michaela's point, but also to the concept of configuring the instance administration settings via config. I didn't get in earlier to say this, but CF 2021 has already added that built in, just like Gert said that Lucee 6 is going to add it, so that instead of having to rely on CF config, because not everybody's going to have CF config, CF 2021 had added what they call CF setup, and that allows you to either export or import JSON-based config of anything in CF admin, either
No
everything
more
or something.
XML.
Say again?
No more XML files.
Yes, no more XML. I mean, let's be clear. It's still
XML.
there, but you have that choice if you want to create JSON-based config. And then to your point, Mark, one can then automate a deployment or automate testing and totally script it all. But we should also say, back to the original point about updating, is that updating can be done via scripting. It doesn't have to be done through a UI. It can all be done through a Java command. And the installation, even if you're not using Docker images, the installation of CF can be silently configured totally via script. So updates can be done via script. So people who want to do such automation can. The interesting challenge, again, I find is that sometimes in our circles, there's such a wide variety of people. And some people are like, they never, ever think of or care to automate things. So they want a UI. And in fact, when CF 2021 came out, they made a big noise about, hey, there's now a zip-based installer. You don't have to run an installer anymore. You just unzip it and you're running CF, just like Lucee Express provided for, CF 2021 provided for. But other people were like, but where's the installer? You know, so there's always these two audiences that have to be catered to. And I'm just saying that CF's ability, and I mentioned this in my modern CF More Modern Than You Think, CF's had the ability to do scripted automated installs in various ways for many years, but a lot of people don't know it because they don't do it. And the ones who do that a lot have often moved to either to other platforms because they wanted it and they didn't think it was there, or they've moved to Lucee and they don't care about what Adobe does anymore. So they don't know that Adobe's added these things that are there. So it's all getting better, and over time word spreads, and we're all getting better in better and better places as time passes.
And on that,
excellent. Yes. Why don't we wrap up then with why it's still wise to use ColdFusion or CFML?
Wise. I mean, why wouldn't you? Have you read, the documentation in other languages? Jesus. I've read the documentation on many other languages. Like, I think CFML is intuitive. It's got nice, clean separation. You can be as messy or as tidy as you want. You're not being dictated by anyone on how you should do it. You have the freedom and both the support to do wonderful things.
And as we've talked today, it's evolved in many, many, many ways, so that sometimes the arguments against it and why it seems unwise, they're often unfounded or they're no longer accurate. But we again have to acknowledge that some people are just going to be in a position where to them it doesn't make sense. If they've done a fair evaluation and neither Adobe and anything they've done, nor Lucee and anything they've done, if for some reason it doesn't suit their situation, then it's understandable, they move on. But I would just always call for people to give a fair consideration to both. And I mean both. I'm not talking about this CF versus Lucee. I'm saying whatever you're on, before you give up on it, make sure you've considered it fairly. Because I see so many discussions in the community where people who are currently using a thing will say it can't do it, and it turns out they just hadn't tried it. They were basing their knowledge on a year or two ago, or what they heard from somebody who they thought was telling what was true, and it's not. So that's why I'm always on a bit of a tirade about making sure people know what's current.
Appreciate your tirades on ColdFusion is modern, Charlie.
Thank you, sir.
I wrote a long article on is ColdFusion dying, and happy to link in any extra things there you have that you've written.
Well, I wanted to give you props when you were bringing up the CIO discussion. It got sidetracked, so I didn't get to. But you've been, of all of us, you've been doing a great job of that in your resources, whether it's the CF Live book
Mhm.
or the videos that you do, the podcast, the
Yeah.
blog entries. So yeah, thank you for that.
Well, the reason I do that is because I want
Sorry, I have to
ColdFusion
leave.
to be.
I'll leave
You have to
guys
leave.
Oh,
They're all
clap.
leaving. There's only 2 left. Thank you, Mark.
We'll wrap
Indeed.
up with this last point you were making, Michaela.
Yeah, sure.
Mark.
You know, obviously, ColdFusion developers write the code, and ColdFusion DevOps people, get it deployed right. But at the end of the day, if the CIO level doesn't give the green light to using the technology, no one's going to be coding in it. So, they are a very important audience for keeping the language alive, as are at a more remote level, the CEO level, because, they also need to be happy with the technology their company is using. So I think it is important, for some of the conversations to be directed towards that level.
Absolutely. So again, great for bringing it up, and thanks for what you're doing in that regard. And with that, I should scoot too. So
yes, we're all complete. Thanks for staying on so long, Charlie. Appreciate everything, and enjoy the rest of Dev Week.
Thanks. See you guys.
Get detailed show notes on today's episode in your free CF Alive Modern ColdFusion Guide at teratech.com. That is teratech.com. Viva la CF Alive Revolution!